Hey guys, I'm trying a new background noise. Hopefully, it's something that people don't get annoyed with. Anyway, I'm not freestyling right now. So that's our new background music, guys. I got the receipts on it. So this would be our new background. So no more feeding the ducks. All right, guys. So with that said, Vanilla Charles. All right. So let me share my screen and show y'all what's up. So we're going to be continuing the Life of Christ stuff. I'm going to knock out going over these lectures. By the way, I'll show you all this. Ashley's going to be doing a presentation Saturday on the sepulchral structure of the Bible. Okay. I'm going to show you all this as well. So here we are. We got Peaceful Banana on the 12th, doing his show like typically, as far as I know. Kurt's stuff's not in here, but he's so dependable, I don't have to put him on there. And looks like we're doing an after show for Dan Chapa this Friday. And then Ashley's going to give that presentation. As you see in seminary, I'm in week 12. Okay. Oh, that says quiz 9. I'm fixing to take quiz 8, if I remember right. So it's a good thing that I'm fixing to take that stuff out in lecture right now, because it's going to get really complicated. And you see my final is coming up too. But you see, I got a debate with Sean Griffin. As far as I know, that's the only debate in between. I'd have to check later on. But I have a Sean Griffin debate on free grace. It's the second one we've done on that. And then I have a debate with Dit, who's a free gracer on First John. And then a debate with George. I can't remember his last name, but he's how would you say it? He's dispensational salvationist rather than a dispensationalist that believes salvation is the same. And there's another one, Jeff Dollar, I think, is on this day. So things are going to start getting hectic. And Praise told me that Kelly Powers is going to be doing an open mic addressing free gracers. So I might be able to pull up on that if I get everything done in time. But it's going to get hectic. All right. So let me. Life of Christ. Hey, Big Stack. I don't know. I've never used another beat before, so I don't know if it restarts or how that will happen. We'll just see. But if the beat's not too loud, we're good. All right. So here's a reminder. We're using Yeshua, the Life of the Messiah. I mentioned in previous videos. I need to turn that down just a little bit more. Just a little bit background, yeah. I've mentioned in previous videos where you can find content that's directed towards, a church setting, or as well as the curriculum and all that stuff. And of course, you can always take the class at Schaefer Seminary. Now, so what we're going to be looking at today is right here, the preparation of the Messiah's death. And then we're also going to be going into, well, that's still going to be underneath that. We also use Ariel's harmony. And so here's our main structure. Introduction of the king, authentication of the king, the controversy over the king, the training of the 12 by the king, the opposition to the king, the preparation of the disciples by the king, the official presentation of the king, the preparation for the death of the king. And we've already done the prophecies of the king, which was Matthew 24 and all that stuff. I can barely hear the background music on my iPad. Okay, I'll turn it up then. How's that? All right. Okay. And so we're going to focus on the preparation for Messiah's death, the prediction of his death. 12th of Nisan, Tuesday, April 4th, AD 30. Okay, so let me go into slideshow mode. Why would you do that? Wait, hold on. I'm having all weird things happening here. Okay. So, for some reason, it switched my slideshow. All right, here we go. Preparation of the death of the king. Preparation for Messiah's death. Essentially, he's just talking about where it structures in the outline. So we'll go to the next part, the prediction of his death. Now, in paragraph 140, we have the prediction of his death. It's still Tuesday, the 12th of Nisan, and our day, April 4th, AD 30. Mark's account states, Mark 14:1, that after 2 days was the feast of the Passover, the unleavened bread. In the Mosaic law, the feast of Passover was 1 day, followed by 7 days of unleavened bread. And those were 2 separate festivals, though one immediately followed the other. Now, by first century Israel, even among Jewish people today, that kind of combined the two, and therefore you hear Jewish people talk about the 8th day of Passover. But technically, Passover was only 1 day, followed by 7 days unleavened bread. And by the New Testament times, you follow on 8 days, called both Passover and unleavened bread, as it is here. And he points out what happened 2 days after these words, so Passover could fall on sundown Thursday. We have here the 4th announcement of the death, but this time he even dates it, as Matthew 26:2 points out. Again, they don't understand these things, so when it finally happens, it catches them by surprise, as we'll see. All right. So we're going to be going into the conspiracy of the rulers, the pouring of the anointment, the promise to betray, the last Passover, the first Lord's Supper. Then we're going to go into the preparation for the Seder, 9 steps in preparing for the Passover. So we'll start those real quick, kind of do a flyover and then a dive into. First, they had to go with the lamb to the temple. Secondly, in the temple compound, the lamb would be killed. Thirdly, the blood would be poured out into a bowl of some kind. Fourthly, the bowl would be taken from one priest to another, passed by hand until it got to the altar. Then the blood would then be poured out at the base of the altar. Okay, so here we go. Now, in the second thing in paragraph 140b is the conspiracy of the rulers. The conspiracy includes both Pharisees and Sadducees. So as you can see at the end of Mark 14:1, the chief priests are the Sadducees, the scribes are the Pharisees. And Matthew also adds the elders of the people. They're also Pharisees. And this one that's in charge of the conspiracy in Matthew 26:3 is Caiaphas, who is the high priest with authority over the 24 chief priests. He's also a Sadducee. And the go was in Matthew 26:4. They took counsel together that they might take Jesus by suddenly and kill him. So again, this conspiracy includes both Pharisees and Sadducees. And they're looking for a way they can get Jesus arrested, apart from the multitudes of Matthew 26:5. And as we'll see shortly in the next couple of paragraphs, Judas will give them that opportunity. Let's notice one more thing in the conspiracy to Mark 14:2. Now during the feast, lest happily they should be tormented to the people. Now notice carefully that the conspiracy includes the fact that they would not carry out the conspiracy during the Passover. At the Passover time, the city was very crowded, and basically they wanted to wait to after the Passover. The pilgrims go back home. Jerusalem turns back to a smaller size, and then they will carry it out. And here we have the satanic element of the conspiracy, because while Satan wants Jesus dead, he doesn't want him to die at the right time, at the Passover, in the right way, by crucifixion. And so we read attempts to have him killed, either at the wrong time or right here before or after the Passover, or killed in the wrong manner, like by sword or by stoning. Because if Jesus had died at any other time than the Passover in any other way than by crucifixion, there would have been no atonement. It was not merely the death of the Messiah which was essential for the atonement. Otherwise, he could have died as the 60-year-old with the others of Bethlehem, and that would have been sufficient. But that would have been insufficient. His death had to come at the proper time, this Passover, and in the proper way, by crucifixion. All right, I'm looking at the chats every once in a while. The attempts is made to kill him at the wrong time and the wrong way. So keep in mind, because we'll be coming back to this a bit later. Part of the conspiracy is to avoid doing it on the night they had to end up doing it, and they wanted to avoid doing it during the Passover, the pouring of the anointment. Now, paragraph 141, we come to the pouring of the anointment. They have a dinner at the home of Simon the leper. The fact that Simon is called a leper doesn't mean he still is a leper. Otherwise, he would not be allowed to live in town. This was a former leper among the lepers that Jesus would have healed. And he's in Bethany, and that's the same town where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha live. And they're all together in his household. And so the guests in the home of Simon the leper. And Mary at this point chooses to do something that would be very unusual to do. She takes a bottle of very expensive anointment of perfume and she pours it into Mark 14:3 on his head. And John points out that the end of John 12:3 also on her feet. So both his head and his feet are anointed with special oil or perfume. Now, this was a very expensive type of perfume. It doesn't mean that they were necessarily a wealthy family, but it does mean that she's given some things up, because there were some things even the poorer class of women would keep in reserve for the wedding night. And for the wealthy class, they could use it more often, but for the non-wealthy class, it was a one-time thing that they were able to use on their wedding night. And so essentially, she's given up something that she would have used on her wedding night to anoint him with. And how expensive it comes out in Mark 15:5. He says it could have been sold for 300 pence, basically 300 denarii. That's about 1 year's salary. So 1 full year's salary is how expensive this perfume was that she anoints his head and his feet. The disciples of Jesus are troubled by this, saying that this was a wasteful way to do with the expensive perfume. It could have been sold into money given to the poor. And one of the spokesmen happened to be Judas, and while the others may have been motivated by the concern for the poor, that was not Judas's concern, as John 12:6 points out. Now this he said, not because he cared for the poor, because he was the thief, and having the bag took away what he put in therein. He was the group treasurer, and he was guilty of embezzlement. He periodically withdrew from his own private use of money that was put into it. And Jesus silences the disciples. He says, why in Matthew 26:12, for with that she poured the anointment upon my body. She did it to prepare me for my burial. What this shows is that she understood something that these own disciples did not understand. Hello, I can't make out that name because of the font. But anyway, she somehow didn't understand that he taught about his death and resurrection. This would be the time of his death and burial. She goes ahead and anoints him for his preparation. So again, Mary understands something others do not, which also helps to explain that all of the women mentioned coming to the tomb looking for the body. Mary's not one of them. Not this Mary. Other Marys go there, but not this one, because she also will believe in the resurrection, so there's need to try to find a body, and so she doesn't participate in those Sunday morning activities. And in Matthew 26:13, he points out that for Mary, this is going to be a place of honor. In fact, everything in history, people will be speaking of this event as memorial to her, as we're doing right now. Now, for Judas, his decision to betray Jesus occurs at this point in time. The promise to betray. Now, paragraph 142, the promise to betray. Now, as we have seen in different people being demonized through the gospel accounts, in the case of Judas, has just been demonized. But Luke says in Luke 22:3 that Satan entered into Judas. So he's not really demonized, he's satanized. In the place of normal demon being in a person is Satan that now entered Judas, setting the stage for him to begin to communicate with the Jewish elders. Specifically, he's reading Matthew 26:14, the chief priests, which are the Sadducees. Luke mentions the 22:4 also with the captains, meaning the captains of the temple. These were the Jewish temple police. Now, Gentile soldiers could be stationed in the outer court to maintain order. So when Paul was mobbed in the outer court, Gentile soldiers could run down and rescue Paul from the mob. But no Gentile could be inside the inner court. And so there was a Jewish temple police force to maintain order in the inner court. And they involved in the conspiracy here, so they'd be the ones to be involved in the arresting of Jesus. And negotiations of how much they're going to pay him ultimately came down to 30 pieces of silver. In Matthew 26:15, full of Zechariah's prophecy, the Messiah will be sold out for 30 pieces of silver. In Zechariah 11:4 and 14. Now, Judas was needed to do 3 things. He paid this money to accomplish 3 things. He will accomplish 2 of those 3 things. First of all, he was needed to show where Jesus could be arrested apart from the multitudes. We saw in paragraph 140 they're trying to find a way to arrest him by subtlety, away from the multitude. So they need to have Judas find an opportunity to have Judas arrested away from the multitudes. The second reason he was in need to do with the point of the Roman law. Now, by Roman law, a Roman cohort could not be released to make an arrest until someone appeared before the Roman governor, accusing him of some crime punishable under Roman law. I repeat, a Roman cohort could not be released to make an arrest until someone first appeared before the Roman governor, accusing another of a crime punishable under Roman law. A second reason they would need Judas for is to appear before the Roman governor, who was then Pontius Pilate, and accuse Jesus of a crime punishable under a Roman law. And he will accomplish the second purpose as well. We should see later this evening. There's a third reason we needed, and this is to serve as the prosecuting witness at the civil or Roman trial. He won't be needed for the Jewish trial. He'll be needed for the Roman trial or civil trial. As we'll see, he'll fail to fulfill the third element. Let's spend a few moments now focusing on the significance of 30 pieces of silver, because this was not an accidental price. Now, in the Mosaic law, in Exodus 21:32, the law said that if you owned an ox and your ox lured to death your neighbor's slave, you're obligated to pay your neighbor the amount of 30 pieces of silver. That was the value of a dead slave. As history progressed, that became a symbolic number of contempt. If you wanted to show contempt for somebody, you would give them 30 pieces of silver, conveying to that person you're worth as much as the dead slave is worth. So if someone was purchasing a thing, was negotiating for a price, to avoid the figure 30, they would settle for either 29 or 31. Not unlike our situation here in America. Concerning the number 13 is considered a bad luck number. Often in high-rise hotels I stay in my travels, I notice that the elevator goes from floor 12 to floor 14. Floor 13 has been raptured somewhere and it's gone. It doesn't exist. And even in the third level hotel I'm staying in right now, I noticed that the room numbers go from 211. They have odd numbers on one side. Even on the other side, they go from 211 to 215. There's no 313. Again, to avoid the figure 13. Well, for them, it was the figure 30, not 13. Now, when Zechariah became a prophet, God asked Zechariah to play a messianic role, a role the Messiah will fulfill, the role of the good shepherd. And this was Zechariah 11:4 and 14. For a period of time, he would defeat the flock of slaughter, to feed the flock that would be destined for slaughter. After the period of feeding, he was then to go before the Jewish leaders and say, we did not agree to a salary in advance, so pay me what you think my worth is worth. If it's worth something for you to pay me accordingly. If it's worth nothing to you, it's okay to pay me nothing. It would have been a lot less insulting to Zechariah to pay him nothing, but to show the contempt for the prophet to pay him 30 pieces of silver, saying to Zechariah, how much is your work worth? It's worth the price of a dead slave. And then God told, my phone is flashing. 1 second, guys. Oh, Truth Gardener. She's commenting on my other videos. And then God chose Zechariah to do two things. First of all, to take the 30 pieces of the silver and dump them in the temple compound area, just as Judas would do with his 30 pieces of silver. But secondly, he was told, Zechariah, that this was a goodly price. I was priced by them. That was a goodly price. I was priced by them. But God told Zechariah that something day will come that God himself, the God of Israel, will be sold out for a price of a dead slave. And so when the chief priests were negotiating with Judas for the price of betrayal, to show the contempt for Jesus, they did not settle for 29 or 31. They settled for 30 to show the contempt. And he sold out the Messianic God-man for the price of a slave. Let me turn on my fan on low, get some air going here. Let me turn on my fan low while I bust this flow. Let everybody know I'm trying to know God's in control. All right, here we go. One more important thing to notice here, because he's dealing with the chief priests, all the income for the chief priests came out of the temple treasury. That's where all the finances came from. So ultimately, these 30 pieces of silver came out of the temple treasury. One major purpose for the temple treasury was to purchase sacrifices. Now, this was not their intent that day. That's what they did that day. They purchased a sacrifice, the final sacrifice for sin. There's irony there. As Luke points out in Luke 22:6, from that point on, Judas was looking for an opportunity where Jesus could be arrested away from the multitudes. The last Passover and the first Lord's Supper. On the outliner, the point 5, notice the second paragraph. For paragraph 143 to 148, we have paragraphs dealing with the last Passover and the first Lord's Supper. Also notice as you go through these paragraphs, it keeps going back between paragraph for paragraph, this to that, back and forth, back and forth. A.T. Robinson and put this harmony together from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. Obviously didn't have any Jewish friends that he could inquire if he didn't quite understand the order of the Passover, and so got the order basically wrong. Had he stayed with Luke's order, he would have made a lot less mistakes, but he violates Luke's order as Luke gives us. And he thought Luke had 1 cup too many. In reality, Luke actually has 2 cups too few. I've rearranged his harmony. Notice most of it's like Luke's. Order is best fits the order of the way Jewish people observe the Passover to this day. The preparation for the Seder. And in paragraph 143, we have the preparation for the Seder. The Seder is the Hebrew name for the Passover meal. The word Seder means order because you follow the order in a very specific step-by-step process. And Luke 22:7 specifies, and the day of the unleavened bread came on which the Passover must be sacrificed. And Luke 22:7, again, notice again, by this point in time, Passover and unleavened bread were tied together and not kept distinct anymore. And the 2 men in charge of getting the Passover ready in Luke 22:8 is Peter and John. And so they said to make ready the Passover. And as the temple stood, that required specific steps to be followed. 9 specific steps in getting the Passover ready. They were the orderly steps, set of steps once you had the meal. But first of all, they had to go with the lamb to the temple compound. The lamb will be tested to make sure it was without spot and without blemish. Secondly, they would then kill the lamb inside the temple compound. Thirdly, the blood will be poured upon a bowl of some kind, because this was a feast that was one of the 3 festivals. You had to go where the temple was. That was a private period of time that they had 3 long lines of Levites going from the outer temple all the way into the outer court, into the inner court to where the altar was. And in the outer area here, you would kill the lamb and catch your blood, and then the blood was poured into the bowl. And then fourthly, the bowl would be passed from one piece to another, until it got to the altar. Then the blood was put out on the base of the altar. And they had 3 long lines to carry this out. All this was done in 3-hour periods from about 3 in the afternoon to 6 in the evening. Fifthly, they would then sing certain psalms, Psalms 113 through 118. Sixthly, the lamb would then be clean, and this means they would skin the lamb, then trails would be removed. Seventh, the part of the lamb would be left for the priesthood to partake of, and the priest would then bring it upon the altar. 8, the rest of the lamb was taken home to be roasted by fire. And 9, the other Passover items would then be prepared and made ready. That would include especially the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, and the wine. Essentially, this is what Peter and John would be doing. Now, because so many pilgrims were coming to Jerusalem from the Passover, it was impossible to house everybody within the walls of the city. So outside the walls, they erected these huge tent cities. And most pilgrims would eat with the Passover in these tents outside the wall. So since you have very special preparations, unless you lived in Jerusalem, you couldn't have it within, or you have preparations made to have it with somebody. And so the Jews made special preparations. He tells these 2 men that when they go back into the city in Luke 22:10, go by the well, and what they'll see is a man with a pitcher of water, gathering water. And why is that unusual? Because in the concept of the Middle East, it's still true with the Arab towns in Israel to this day. It is the woman who goes out for the water, not the men. So it'd be very unusual to see the man carrying a pitcher and drawing water. They are to follow the man, and he will show the house. And what they will see is that the place he has already been prepared. In church tradition, this is the house of John Mark, and the same room became later the place of the events of Acts 2:1 and 4. It's also the same room of Acts 1:13 where they choose a replacement for Judas. And he points out this is very significant Passover because of Matthew 26:18. My time is at hand. There will be the Passover fulfillment. Of this Passover he will die, and Jews reckon the time. Keep in mind, Passover will fall from sundown to sundown. Now Mark 14:15 points out what they will be shown in the upper room, what is referred to in Hebrew as Aliyah. It's interesting, it's called Aliyah because Aliyah the singer, which I think means ascent or whatever, but it's also used for the upper room. It would be a second room, which is typical of only the wealthy class would have this kind of room. It would not be a hallway, but a separate room on the second floor. And furthermore, the stairwell leading to its outside the house not inside the house. So you could go in and out without going through the lower part of the house. Notice two things about it. Number one, it was already furnished. They would include, there will be the table. There wouldn't be any chairs, because the Passover you sat on the ground and leaned against large pillows. Because at the Passover Seder, the Passover meal, you recline. You don't sit in chairs, but you recline. And secondly, it was ready. In other words, everything else needed for the feast was already prepared. All they needed was to deal with the lamb after it came from the temple compound, but everything else was already prepared. There'd be no more further work they would have to do. And so Jesus made all the arrangements to have everything ready well before the night. At the Matthew 26:19, they were ahead and they made ready the Passover. It's not the 14th of Nisan on April 6, 8030. Now we need to do some background work before we go into some other paragraphs. The central element of the Passover is called the breaking of the afikomen. Breaking of the afikomen. In the center table, you have one bag. It's the matzah, tash. Or maybe that's tash, but I think it's probably tash. It is one bag, but it does three separate compartments. In each compartment, you place a loaf of unleavened bread. These are the loaves of the unleavened bread used for Passover. What you have is one bag with three compartments. Each compartment has a loaf of unleavened bread, each one separated from the other by a single sheet. What happens here will become the central ceremony of the Passover. Exactly how to become a central facet, we don't know. It was only practiced in the intertestamental period. Now, when Jesus said, "This is my body," keep in mind, he made the statement strictly of the Passover bread. He didn't say it of those little wafers that some churches use, or regular bread that's been toasted and cut up in small squares, as I've seen elsewhere. He made the statement specifically of the Jewish Passover bread. And by law, three things had to be true of this bread for it to be qualified for Passover. If any of these three things were missing, you could not use it for Passover. First of all, it had to be unleavened. That's why it's flat. Notice, it has to be unleavened. Leavened through the Bible is the symbol of sin. And this is also a picture of his body, that his body was unleavened, meaning he was sinless. Had he committed even one minor sin, he would have been disqualified for being the Passover sacrifice. As it turns out, he was the only Jew who ever lived that kept the Mosaic law perfectly in the 613 commandments. Not really 16, but okay. Applicable to him, so he had no leavened body. Secondly, notice it had to be striped. If the stripes were missing, they could not be eating at the Passover. It had to be striped. And the body of Jesus was also striped by way of Roman whip at the time of the scourging, as Isaiah prophesied in Isaiah 53, with the stripes we are healed. Kind of getting in. And the third element is also to be pierced, so light would penetrate through the unleavened bread. If these holes were missing, it could not be eaten at the Jewish Passover. It had to be pierced. His body was also pierced twice. First of all, by the nails at his crucifixion, and secondly, by the spear inside. As Zechariah 12:10 prophesies, someday they will look at him. They shall look at him in whom they pierced. So being pierced in the stripe and the leaven becomes a picture of the body of the Messiah. Keep in mind, specifically, it's his bread that he identifies as his body. In the ceremony, close to the early part of the Passover, it was taken out of this three-compartment bag is the middle loaf. It's broken in two. Half of it was wrapped in linen cloth. It must be linen cloth and hidden away somewhere, and there it stays for a long time. And having finished the first ceremony, then you have the main meal. And then following the main meal, you have the second ceremony that begins by removing the unleavened bread and then breaking out the smaller pieces, passing it around to everybody around the table. Everybody eats a piece of this bread. Now, what's interesting in Judaism is this: in all the rituals of Judaism practices, biblical ones and rabbinical ones, that always have a reason for ritual they perform. We do this because of that. We do this because of this. In fact, for all the rituals of the Passover, there's quite a few. For every ritual they have, there's an explanation as to why we do this, in remembrance of that. But on this one, strangely enough, they have no explanation. But what most of the rabbis have come up with so far is that three loaves represent the Kohanes, which is the priesthood, the Levites, and the house of Israel. What they don't explain is why the middle one is taken out, why it's broken, why it's wrapped in linen cloth, why it's hidden away, and why it's brought out again. When a Jew becomes a believer in the Messiahship of Jesus, he finally recognizes this signifies what Jesus said: "This is my body given for you." One bag with three compartments. We believe there's only one God. He exists in three different persons: the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The middle one is taken out of the bag, which represents the incarnation, which God became man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The breaking of the middle loaf is a picture of his death. When we come to this part of ceremony, that's when he said, "This is my body broken of you." It is then wrapped up in linen cloth. The body of Jesus, when he came down from the cross, also wrapped up in linen cloth. The hiding away is a picture of his burial. The other supper, it is brought out, wrapped in a picture of his resurrection. Now, during the Passover service, you drink 4 cups of wine. Every cup has its own name. The first 2 cups are drunk before dinner. Then immediately after the dinner, the connection with the unwrapping of this, you had the 3rd cup. And the 3rd cup is called in Judaism the cup of redemption. And in Judaism symbolizes the physical redemption of the firstborn in the 10th plague. And in the case of Jesus, it's the 3rd cup because he rose on the 3rd day. But that's a spiritual redemption involved, not a physical one. Then pieces are given over to each one around the family. And he told in John 6, you must eat his flesh and drink his blood to have eternal life. And he interprets that to mean to believe that he's the Messiah, Messianic King. So this is the central ceremony. We'll see what happens here as we move through the text. All right. So this is what we've been talking about. They would then sing Psalms 113 through 18. Sixthly, the lamb would then be clean, meaning skinned, the entrails removed. 7, part of the lamb will be left for the priesthood, and the priesthood will bring it up to the altar. 8, the rest of the lamb will be taken to be roasted by the fire. 9, other Passover items will be prepared and made ready like the unleavened bread, bitter herbs, and the wine. So we're talking about the Passover observance, the first cup, the washing of the feet, and the first prediction of Judas's betrayal, and then the carpus, the second prediction of Judas's betrayal. Passover observance. Let's go to paragraph 141a, the Passover observance. Now in Luke's account, Luke 22:14, and when the hour has come, he sat down with them, and again he focuses on the uniqueness of the Passover. He says in verse 15, with desire, I desire to eat this Passover with you, but I suffer this Passover. He observed Passover with them before. He was very careful to keep the Mosaic law, so we came to Jerusalem after Passover. But this one is a special Passover because this will be the Passover in which the feast will finally be fulfilled. It will be ratified by blood, his own blood. And he points out this will be the last Passover until the Messianic kingdom. In the kingdom, he will again observe the Passover, later specified as we'll see with the apostles. The first cup. Now go back to paragraph 148, the first cup. Now again in the Passover dinner, you have 4 cups of wine. And the first 2 cups are drunk before dinner. And here's where A.T. Robinson just combined everything, not recognizing the distinctions. And Luke 22:17-18, the reference it makes here is the first cup. Verse 17 says, and he received a cup, and when he given thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourself. Notice he gave thanks for us. The first cup of Judaism called the cup of thanksgiving. And the way the ceremony begins is the candles are lit by the women of the household. If she's not present, there are no women in the Passover. A man does it. Then comes a partaking of the first cup. And the first cup actually inaugurates the first ceremony. So he took the cup and he gave a special thanksgiving over it. And again, he points out in Luke 22:18, this will be the last Passover until the establishment of the kingdom. Also notice the phrase, the fruit of the vine. And people who believe that they drink grape juice use that. It doesn't say wine. It says fruit of the vine. But if you look at any Passover book, it uses the phrase, but the wine you sip from the Jewish context would always be fermented. The term for the wine was a term used for Passover wine because other wines were made. And sometimes they had a thing or two to leaven in it. To ferment quickly, they would put some leaven in it. But Passover wine had to ferment naturally. And therefore you'll find you go to a Jewish store, for example, you see wines listed before kosher for Passover, not kosher for Passover. All wines are kosher by the days, but only certain wines are kosher for Passover. Only those that have been properly prepared. The washing of the feet, the first prediction of Judas' betrayal. Now go to paragraph 145. In the Jewish service of the Passover, following the observance of the first cup, you then have the washing of the hands. Now John's account, John 13:1, points out even before the Passover, Jesus already knew from his humanity that his hour was come to make the atonement. So verse 1 was a statement of his awareness before the Passover. And then verse 2 says that during the supper, now we're at the Passover supper. And by then verse 2 says Judas already made the decision to betray him. And normally the one who washes the hand is a servant, and he or she will go to each person with the bowl and the pitcher. You put your hands over the bowl, and he or she will pour the water over the hands, and there's a towel wrapped around the side of the servant. You take the towel and you dry your hands. In the case where we find is, first of all, Jesus takes the servant robe and does the washing, and furthermore, in place of the washing hand, he washes the feet. But taking on the servant robe pictures what Jesus teaches it. What Paul teaches in Philippians 2:5-8. Then he came as a servant. When it comes to Peter, Peter just can't see the Messiah washing his feet and raises the question at the end of John 3:6. Lord, do you wash my feet? The Greek is a bit more emphatic. The way the Greek reads is something like this. Is such a one like you to wash the feet as such as one as I? Is such a one like you going to wash the feet of someone such as I? And it requires a negative answer. No, you won't. You won't wash my feet. But then Jesus says in 13:9, if I wash you not, you have no part with me. You won't be part of my household. So Peter says in that case, wash all of me. But he says in John 13:10, he that is babe need not to save to wash his feet, but in clean every whit. You are clean, but not all. Now most people, unless they were wealthy class, didn't have their own bath house in their own home, so they would use a public bath house you would not go to. And in the dry streets of Israel in the months along summer months, by the time you got home, your feet would be dirty again because of the dust and so on. And there was always a place at the door where you would wash your feet before you would go into the house. Thus the point is this, that once you receive salvation, you've been bathed, but our feet get dirty because we still sin, and therefore we must only cleanse our feet, and we do that by 1 John 1:9, confessing our sins. He points out they're not all clean, and here's a reference to Judas, because in John 13:11, he knew who should betray him. And in John 13:15, he points out this was given to them as an example. It's not really an ordinance as some churches teach, that you have to wash people's feet. It's not an ordinance, it's merely an example to take on the role of a servant. But in John 13:8, he points out that there's a somewhat present who will betray him, who had the first prediction of the betrayal. No one is named or shown yet, but it's the first prediction of the betrayal within the Passover dinner. Carpus, the second prediction of Judas' betrayal. Let's go to paragraph 146a. What cuts here is only the account of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What John is doing is something different. The O.T. Robinson didn't quite understand the difference at picking up on the previous Matthew 26:21. Verily, I say to you, the one of you shall betray me. That's the continuation of what just happened in the previous paragraph. Now, Mark 14:18 says, and as that they sat, notice the number of the word sat. If you look at the footnote, you notice it means the meaning of reclining, because at the Passover table you recline. Now, what happens in the ceremony is called the carpus. In the carpus ceremony, you take a green vegetable, normally a piece of lettuce, you dip it in the salt water and you eat it. Green is a symbol of spring, and spring is a symbol of youth, and this signifies that they were just a young nation in the springtime of a nationhood. God gave us by means of the salt water of the Red Sea, and scattered across the table with several salt water dishes. So there was a salt water dish within an easy reach of 3 or 4 people. There are at least 13 people involved with this Passover. So he makes the announcement that one of you is going to betray me. He wanted no one to know who it was. He does not name anyone. This is the second time he prophesies about a betrayal, but he hasn't named anyone, but he does give a clue in Matthew 26:23. He that dipped his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. What happened at that point is that Jesus would have taken his parsley, a green vegetable, dip it in the saltwater dish. At this point, Jesus put his parsley and dipped it with Jesus in the same saltwater dish. In the act of Judas identified him as the betrayer, but the apostles elsewhere at the table did not catch the signal. All right. So we talked about the breaking of the middle of the matzah, the sop, the third prediction of Judas' betrayal, the third cup. We're going into that. A lesson in greatness, the prediction of Peter's denial, the Hallel, Mark 14:26, Matthew 26:30. Then we're going to go into the promises and admonitions by the king in the upper room, on the way to Gethsemane, the high priesthood prayer concerning himself and concerning the apostles. The breaking of the middle matzah. And by the way, I'm not evaluating any of this. I'm just reading it so that it's in my head whenever I take my quiz. I'll evaluate it later. Now we go on to paragraph 148, back to 148. Now we come to the breaking of the middle matzah, the middle loaf that I just illustrated. In Luke's account, Luke 22:19, and he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. At this point, he took the middle loaf out, broke it in two, wrapped half of it up in the linen cloth, and having it, noting the word remembrance, because that's the key word to the whole Passover service. If you go from ritual to ritual to ritual, it's always the same. We do this to remember that. We do this to remember this. The focus is on remembrance. He's not teaching transubstantiation. The bread turns into the real body, not constantiation, that the true body is with the bread. Rather, it's a remembrance. It's a memorial of his body. The sop, the third prediction of Judas' betrayal. Now back to paragraph 146, the sop. This is something you do before dinner was served. Now there was a mixture called a carosette. Carosette is a mixture of apples, nuts, honey, cinnamon, wine, lemon juice. That's apples, nuts, honey, wine, cinnamon, and lemon juice. Everything is chopped up very small, then mixed together, and let stand for about 24 hours until it turns to a deep brown color, the color of brick and mortar. And that's eating for the purpose of reminding the Jewish people or remembrance of the work they had to do with Egypt for slaves to make bricks and brick mortar to build the storehouses of Pharaoh. Now the way that you do the ceremony is you take a piece of unleavened bread about the size and you dip it into kaseret and also dip it into horseradish. That's to make the tears come as a reminder of the bitterness of slavery and the mourning for the sons were killed by drowning. And then you take a second piece of small bread and put it on top and you have a small sandwich, and everybody dip their own green vegetable, the parsley, on their own. But this was done by one who officiates. In this case, there was Jesus. He would do this 13 times, one for each of the 12 and once for himself. So for the third time, he announces one of them will betray him. And again, they all want to know who it is. And again, he does not name anyone, but he does give a second clue. And the second clue is this one, the one that I will give the sop, I give it to him. The one to whom I give the sop, he's the betrayer. Now John's account, John 13:23, notice it says, there was at the table reclining. Notice the word reclining. That's the correct term because the Passover time you recline. And you're always reclined throughout the ceremony, but for certain intervals you recline. You make a further reclining towards the left. And none of the times you recline toward the left is when you eat this particular sop. And again, they wanted to know who he was talking about. And again, he doesn't name anyone, but gets a second clue in John 13:26. He it is for whom I shall dip the sop and give it to him. So when he dip the sop, he took it and give it to Simon, son of Scary. And so the first one to receive the sop is the betrayer. And he dipped the sop, but the first one to receive it was Judas. At the point Judas ends up leaving the festival, he's not here for the remainder of the feast. He won't be there when the community is actually partaking of. Now keep in mind that part of the purpose of the seating is on one hand to remember the slavery in Egypt, but then secondly to bring tears into the eye. And for Jesus, it was a bitter moment. One of his own was about to betray him, which had brought some bitterness to him as well. At this juncture, in John 13:27, Satan again enters into him, and Judas' actions are now going to be inevitable. And Jesus tells him, what you do it quickly. So Judas leaves. And even at this point, the disciples, and all of the clues that were given, the signs that were given, still didn't get it. They're assuming that Jesus sent him out to get some other things for the festival. Notice verse 30. He didn't have him receive the sop, went out straightway, and it was night. This looks like an irrelevant statement. Of course it was night. The Passover was observed only at night, never at the daytime. But again, remember, this is John's gospel. One of the sub-themes is the conflict of light and darkness. It wasn't merely a fact of history that it was nighttime when this happened. The point that Judas himself is of the night. The need he's about to perform is the deed of the night. The third cup. Now we come back to paragraph 148, the latter part. Now again, there are 2 cups drunk in the first ceremony before dinner, and then 2 more cups at the dinner. The third cup is drunk right after dinner. Now look at Luke's account, Luke 22:20. And the cup in this manner after supper. Notice the phrase after supper. That's how we know this is the third cup. The word cup, the Jewish people call the cup of redemption, is the cup he's referring to. In Judaism, it's a symbol of physical redemption, but now it becomes a symbolic of spiritual redemption. He continues in Luke 22:20, the cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. In the Corinthian passage, again, you have the phrase, in remembrance of me, in 1 Corinthians 11:25. So both with the bread and the cup, this is the ceremony we perform in remembrance. Again, not your translation, not constantiation. It is a remembrance. And in Colossians 11:26, for as often you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he come. And that phrase tells you it's a continuous observance. The frequency is for every church to decide. Minutely, it has to be once a year, because when it says as often as you do this, it was offered at the Passover. The Passover is a yearly observance. So minutely, it must be observed at least once a year. But any church can do it more frequently. And some churches, congregations, do it about quarterly. Some churches in the first Sunday of each month. And brethren churches do it every single week. All of those are valid options. The requirement is once a year. After that, every church can choose. It says till we come. Notice it also means that when the second coming, the ceremony will be terminated in case of communion service to remember his body and his blood. For Israel and the kingdom, there will be a sacrificial system, not the Mosaic one, which is ended forever, but the Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48. Now for Israel, there will be a sacrificial system for a single purpose, to show forth his death till he comes. And in Matthew 26:29, notice he says, this will be my last Passover until I drink it new with you. Notice the phrase with you. Now, when the kingdom begins and the first Passover comes, he will have a private Passover service. Once again with these apostles. The 11 men are still with him. And now the cup of redemption, which again was symbolic of physical redemption for Judaism, becomes a spiritual redemption symbol for us. Lesson in greatness. Now, paragraph 144b, the second part of this paragraph. Luke 22:24 through 30, you have a lesson in greatness. Because there was a contention breaking out among the apostles, which of them will end up being the greatest. Again, what they think is going to happen is by the time that these are over, he'll set up the Messianic kingdom. That's what they're anticipating. So all they have these reasons why they will be the ones chosen to be the greatest. And he takes the opportunity to teach them 3 lessons. First of all, there will be a distinction between the body of believers and the unbelieving world. The world exercises lordship by virtue of its authority, but the members of the body are to show greatness by means of servant. Secondly, he himself took on the role of a servant. Therefore, he's becoming their example, becoming a servant, and therefore the example of what greatness involves. But thirdly, the guarantee of the future role that he again repeats the promise he made earlier. They will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel in the Messianic kingdom. The prediction of Peter's denial. Now, paragraph 147 is the second service that always room for discussion, especially between the third and fourth cup. That's what happens in this paragraph. The departure of Judas obviously guaranteed his betrayal, and the betrayal in turn assures his coming death in John 13:31 and 32. And by means of his death, the Son will glorify the Father, but the Son will be glorified by the Father. And in John 13:33, he again shows them of the coming departure. But in verse 34, he leaves a new commandment with them to love one another. And that's the test of one's love for a neighbor, was the love of self, and the love for the neighbor is as Christ loved us. Now, the second most important commandment in the Mosaic law is a love for your neighbor as you love yourself. A very good commandment. The second most important commandment is the Mosaic law, but it can only go so far. We love our neighbor as our love ourselves. We all know people who happen to hate themselves. It is permissible to hate your neighbor like you hate yourself. So he changes the standard. Now we must love one another as he loved us. And how much did he love us enough to die for us, which put us as a much higher standard than the Mosaic law did. Now in Matthew 26:31, he announces his coming departure, announcing that the sheep will be scattered, that on this very night they're going to all disperse away from him. But in Matthew 26:32, again he raised from the dead. What they do not understand, when he's raised from the dead, he'll meet with them in Galilee. So basically he's telling them, do not stay in the city. Once I'm arrested, leave the city and head up to Galilee, a 3-day journey. And 3 days later, he'll be resurrected. He will meet with them up in Galilee. But again, they never catch what he's trying to tell them. And it catches them by surprise, and they don't leave for Galilee until much later. Now in John 13:36, what does he tell them? Although Peter does not understand that someday Peter will follow in the same manner. And indeed, Peter also was crucified, if the church records are correct, on an X-type cross upside down. Now Luke's account, Luke 22:31, he points out that there's been a tremendous spiritual conflict, a spiritual warfare over Peter. As a result, Peter will slip, but it would not fall from the faith. And in Luke 22:31, and once he had turned back, he has established the other apostles. And in fact, Peter will be the first member of the apostolic group to see the resurrected Christ. He'll be the first member of the apostolic group to see the Messiah resurrected. Peter basically claims to have some loyalty to Jesus that others don't have. He says in Matthew 26:33, If I will offend you, I will never be offended. And Peter emphasizes the sureness of his loyalty. So in Mark 14:30, he then receives a prophecy of his denial. But before the second cock crowing, Peter will deny him 3 different times. The first cock crowing is from 9 p.m. until midnight. The second cock crowing is from midnight to 3 a.m. Before the second cock crowing, he will deny him 3 times. Peter affirms that he would never deny him. He says in Matthew 26:35, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. The other, that rhymes. Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And the other apostles emphasize the same sureness. They're ready to die with them even the night, but again, they're not expecting the death, they're expecting the kingdom. Now Luke's account, Luke 22:35 and 38, there's a special repeal of previous instructions. And what he told them in paragraph 70 and 102, paragraph 70 to the 12, paragraph 1 and 2 to the 7. He now withdraws what he said to them earlier. I sent you forth with the purse and the wallet. The shoes lack ye anything? No. But now they need to make provisions for these things, because while he was on earth, they were experiencing kingdom living, and these things would simply be automatically provided. But now they need to make their own preparations. They need to take a coat, to take a wallet, and prepare these things for their journeys. As for the sword, this is not a sword to be used to evangelize with. Those are the swords to defend the faith, but for personal defense will be the purpose of the sword. We're not allowed to kill for the faith, but the faithful must be willing to become martyrs. Now turn for a moment to paragraph 149 and 150 are referred to as the upper room discourse, but there's a break. And notice the paragraph 149 and go to the very end of it. John 14:31, arise, let us go hence. And so they're still in the upper room through paragraph 149, and the conversation continues when they leave for Gethsemane in paragraph 150. Now go to paragraph 152 in Matthew 26:30 account. Should read at the end of the paragraph 149, just before he says, arise, let us go hence. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out unto the Mount of Olives. And in English, the way you have to translate it, because we don't have an equivalent verse, so it looked like they sang a hymn, a noun in English. They left, but actually doesn't say they sang a hymn. The word hymn is a verb in Greek. It literally means and they hymned. And what they hymned in Psalms 113 and 118. We pair it with Psalms 118 being a very important messianic psalm. So Matthew 26:30, in paragraph 152, you would fit into just before arise, let us go hence at the end of paragraph 149. And that's how the Passover ends. Then comes the connection with the fourth cup of wine called the cup of praise. You drink the fourth cup of wine and you sing these psalms and the Passover is finished. We'll take a break till 5 at the hour, then we'll plow through some more material. But we'll keep rolling, guys. So now we're in the section, the promises and admonitions by the king. All right. This takes place in the upper room. At paragraph 150, the conversation continues, but now they're walking towards Gethsemane. The upper room discourse is the seventh of John's 7 signs, the seventh of his 7 signs. In John 14:6, you have the sixth of the 7th I am. Verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. In paragraph 150, John 15:1, you have the 7th of the 7 I ams. I am the true vine. So that completes the 7 discourses, the 7 signs, and the 7 I ams. So what we have here is a lengthy dissertation of his that marks a transition as he moves from the office of a prophet to the office of a priest, though he becomes a priest only with his ascension. Also, we see the transition moving from law to grace. Here he lays down the seeds of later Christian doctrine, and many other doctrines you find in the epistles have the elements of what we find here. He also defines a new relationship that results from his death and resurrection between him and the believer, a relationship that won't be possible until the death and resurrection occurs. And obviously, you can spend a lot of weeks dealing with much truth in these segments, but that's not our purpose. If I was teaching the Gospel of John, that'd be one thing, but I'm teaching the life of the Messiah thematically, so we have to be more thematic. Although there are a total of 25 promises and 13 admonitions. I'll go through 25 promises first, and then we'll follow them with admonitions. What? 50 Cent had 25 questions, or was it 20 questions? I don't remember. We got 25 promises. 25 promises on my dresser. Yes, sir. Anyway, the first promise is found in John 14:2. He's going to prepare a place for them. Secondly, he also promised to confront them to get them where they're going. Now notice here there's a special promise made for believers, a special coming for believers to take them to where he was going. Now where was he going? He was going to heaven. And the specific promise here is a special coming for believers for the purpose of taking them also to where he was going, which meant to take them to heaven. Here we have the first hint of what comes out clearer later on pre-tribulational rapture. Now in post-trib, they claim that once we are raptured, we meet him in the air, you make a U-turn and come back to the earth. But that's not the promise here. The promise is a special coming for believers to take them to heaven. The third promise he made down to John 14:12 is that they would do even greater works than he. The word greater in this context would not mean greater in quality, because nobody can supersede the quality miracles that he performed, but it means greater in number, not greater in quality, but greater in quantity. Fourth, in John 14:13, it promises to answer prayer, and they'll be praying up until now. He has not taught them to pray in his name, but one of the new things that will come up with his death and resurrection is to pray in his name, to pray in his authority. The fifth promise in John 14:16-18 is the coming of the Holy Spirit to indwell them forever. He doesn't say he'll indwell them until they commit their next sin. He'll dwell them forever. Notice at the end of verse 17, the difference between the new and the old. He says the Spirit is with them, but now he will be in them. The Spirit was always with believers, but never in believers, with just some exceptions. Like the prophets in the Old Testament, the Spirit indwelled only some believers, but not all. And furthermore, the indwelling was not necessarily permanent. So David's prayer, his penitential prayer in Psalms 51, take not your Holy Spirit from me. That was a valid Old Testament prayer, but not a valid New Testament prayer. Because here, once the Spirit indwells us, he indwells us forever, he says. Now, what he says is not the indwelling. What saves is the work of regeneration. And once we believe in the Spirit regenerates our dead human spirit, we believe alive to God. And with the Old Testament saint, once he believed the Spirit was with them, but now as we believe, he is in us. The sixth promise of John 14:22 and 21-22 is to be loved by the Father and the Son, to be loved by the Father and the Son. In the same passage, the seventh promise is he'll come to them again after the resurrection. Again, they don't understand that just yet, but he will come again for them after his resurrection. The eighth promise in John 14:26 and 27, the Holy Spirit will teach them to bring to remembrance everything he taught them. The Holy Spirit will teach them and bring to remembrance everything that he taught them. They answered the question how they can remember decades later what he actually taught. Now keep in mind, John writes his gospel in the early 90s. That's about 60 years after Jesus was here. How did he remember all these detailed messages? Because the Holy Spirit brought to remembrance what they have been taught. The ninth promise, peace in the heart, recognizing God is in control. Hey, EWPT4, on the way to Gethsemane. Hopefully you see that you're in my vicinity. Dude pulled up and he said bars. He pulled up like he was a car. I want to know where the rest of you are. I don't know what his initial stand for, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to bust some rhymes some more. I'm going to freestyle off this beat, and hopefully everybody thinks that this is so unique that we are reading something and we got something bumping in the background. So hopefully you like that sound and that you learn something in the process, and that will mean that I won from my conquest. Anyway, on the way to Gethsemane. Moving down to paragraph 150. The 10th promise is a new relationship of being in the Messiah in Christ. A new relationship resulting in being in the Messiah in Christ. Promise number 11 in John 15:15 is they will be his friends. Number 12 in John 15:16, they were chosen for good works. Now in John 15:19 and 22, you have the 13th promise. They will be hated by the world for 3 reasons. First of all, because believers no longer follow the world system. It's one thing to be in the world. It's quite another to be of the world. And with believers no longer of the world system, then there'll be one reason the unbeliever world is going to hate us. A second reason they'll be hated because it's easier to vent anger against a disciple than against Christ himself. A third reason because the world does not know the Father. These 3 reasons actually there are 4. The 4th reason is because the believer lives under a different and a new standard. The believer lives under a different and new standard, which condemns the world. The 14th promise in John 15:26 and 27. The Spirit will bear witness of the Messiah. And the 15th promise in John 15:27 is they themselves will bear witness of him. The 16th promise is they'll be excommunicated from the synagogue, and some of them will also be killed. In fact, 10 of the 11 would die the death of a martyr. This is John 16:2 of the next chapter here. In paragraph 150, the 17th promises that some will be killed. The 18th promises the Holy Spirit is going to convict the world. The Spirit will convict the world of three things. First of all, their unbelief, because they failed to believe in the Messiah. Secondly, they'll be convicted of righteousness, the righteousness of the Messiah, as will be evidenced by his ascension to the Father. And thirdly, the Spirit will convict the world with judgment. The final judgment which shows the prince of the world has been judged. And if the prince of the world has been judged, how much more those who follow him? The 19th promise in John 16:13 is the Holy Spirit will reveal to them what is truth. He revealed to them what his truth is. The 20th promise in John 16:14 is that the Spirit will glorify the Son. The 21st promise in John 16:16 is he will leave and they won't see him for a while. So when they see him again, they will not see him for a while. They will see him again, and the difference is in between a little while, probably a reference to his death where he ceases to see them, and his resurrection when he sees them again. The 22nd promise is in the New Testament method. John 16:25. These things I've spoken to you in proverbs or parables, the hour comes when I shall no more speak unto you in proverbs or parables, but shall tell you plainly of the Father. And so he's been teaching them parabolically, and he's interpret the parables to them. But now he will cease speaking parabolically to them. Now his public ministry will come to an end. He won't be teaching them any further. The 23rd promise is John 16:31 is that they will scatter. They will desert him. The 24th promise is that they will suffer persecution. And John 16:33, the same verse. 25th promise is they will have final victory. Because he overcame the world, they will have final victory. These are 25 promises. All of them could receive a lot of elaboration if we were teaching the Gospel of John, but that's not what we're doing. Going back to paragraph 149, let's not deal with the 13 admonitions. The first admonition is John 14:1, is do not be disturbed. Do not be disturbed because he'll be leaving soon. The second admonition is John 14:16, is that he's the way to God the Father, and no one comes to the Father except through him. The third admonition is John 14:10 and 11, is to keep on believing on him. He's the one who did the will of the Father, and therefore to know him is to know God the Father. Difference is about his words in verse 10. His work in the end of verse 10, by his words and by his works. The works become the evidences of the works. The fourth admonition is John 14:14, is to keep his commandments. In verse 15, he says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Notice, we do not keep his commandments in order to get to love him, but because we love him, we keep his commandments. The keeping of his commandments is the result of our salvation, not a way of gaining it. The fifth admonition in John 14:23 and 24 is to love the Lord, to love the Messiah. The sixth admonition in John 14:28 is to rejoice that he goes to the Father, be glad of his return to the Father. The paragraph 150, the seventh admonition, to abide in Christ. That means of becoming fruitful, to abide in Christ. If the branch does not bear fruit, it says it takes away. The Greek word can also mean to lift up, because the kind of vines they had in the first century Israel, they used by the Arab population within the land. They have vines that go parallel to the ground. When they're sitting on the ground, they won't produce fruit, so they lift up the vine and put a rock underneath it. And once the vine is lifted up, then they can produce fruit. And so will believer that's not bearing fruit, he will lift them up so they can bear fruit. If he still fails to be productive, then there's a burning. What's burning is the fruit, not the person. In 1 Corinthians 3:10 and 15. The eighth admonition is John 15:8, is to bear fruit. That's a sign of true discipleship. The ninth admonition is John 15:10, is to abide in his love. Keep on abiding in his love. The 10th admonition is John 15:13 and 14, is to love one another. The 11th admonition is John 15:27, is to bear witness. Then we go to the later part of the next chapter. The 12th admonition is down in John 16:23 and 24, to ask in his name. To ask in his name. Again, there's a new element in their prayer life. And the 13th admonition at the end of John 16:33 is to be a good cheer. To be a good cheer, because in spite of the persecution you might suffer, nevertheless he has overcome the world. The high priestly prayer concerning himself. Now in paragraph 151, we have the high priestly prayer. On your outline, you have a more detailed outline. Notice the follows a mission to organize your prayer life, and it divides it into three parts. The first segment of this prayer is himself in John 17, 1-8. The specific element that he prays for himself is for the restoration of his glory. The final unveiling of his glory has been veiled since the incarnation, and it gives two reasons for this. First of all, the Son may glorify the Father. And secondly, that now he's approaching his death, the resurrection, his work is finished. It was temporarily unveiled at the transfiguration, but veiled again by the time they came up the mountain. And now he prays for a final unveiling since he revealed the Father to men. Concerning the apostles, John 17, 9 and 19, he prays for three specific things which are listed on your outline. So preservation, protection, and sanctification. Then we'll be going into considering all believers, unity, and glorification. Then we'll be talking about the agony and the Gethsemane, the nature of it, the meaning of the cup. And we'll just foreshadow some of that. First, he was greatly amazed. The word amazed means to utterly surprised, to be stunned with astonishment. Secondly, he was sore troubled, meaning that he was feeling very heavy, like a heavy weight was pressing on him. Thirdly, his soul was exceedingly sorrow. The term means to be pressed upon, emphasizing the extreme pressure Yeshua was under at that point in time. Fourthly, he was exceedingly sorrowful even unto death. In other words, the sorrow was so great, the pressure so severe, the trouble so heavy, that there was a real danger of a total collapse of his physical frame. I got to turn my fan up. All right. Fifthly, he was in agony. The word agony means conflict. He was in agony in the sense of being in conflict. 6, he began sweating blood, what is called hematidrosis, the meaning of the cup. It could be talking about physical death, premature death, as well as breaking of fellowship. I think that's the other option. We'll get to it in a minute. Yeah, the wrath of God and spiritual death. Preservation. First of all, small a, he prays for the preservation in John 17, 9 and 14. For the preservation, the first reason, there will be 5 reasons. The first reason in John 17, 11 is because he's no more in the world. Secondly, in John 17, 12, while he was in the world, he protected them and guarded them. He would no longer be with them physically. A third reason is because he's glorified in them. The fourth reason is he's the one that has been guarding them. And the fifth reason in John 17, 13, he's now coming to the Father. Protection. Small b, the second thing he prays for them is for their protection in John 17, 15 and 16. Protection. First of all, from Satan, and secondly, because they're no longer of the world, but they're still in it. The sanctification. The third thing he prays about them is sanctification in John 17, 17 and 19. It's a word that means to be set apart. They have now been set apart for the same mission. And now they have to become more and more sanctified, which is the wider teaching, to become more and more conformed to the image of the Son of God. Concerning all believers, John 17, 20 and 26. The third part of his prayer concerns all the believers. Notice John 17, 20, neither for these only do I pray, but them also that believe on me through the word. He went from himself to specifically his apostles, and now to all believers that become believers through apostolic mission. Unity. He prays for 2 things on your outline: the unity, and possibly because the Holy Spirit indwells all believers. Glorification. And the second for the glorification. Now 6 times in the period he refers to God as Father. 6 times. The first time, the second line, John 17, 2, there. Father, the hours come. The second time in John 17, 5. And now, O Father. The third time in the middle of John 17, 11. Holy Father. The fourth time, second line in John 17, 21. Your Father. The fifth time, John 17, 24. Father. And the 6th time in John 17, 25. O righteous Father. So now keep in mind, he called him 6 times Father. I'll come back to that when we deal with the crucifixion tomorrow. But notice for now, 6 times he calls him Father. The agony of Gethsemane, paragraph 152. Now we come to paragraph 152, the agony of Gethsemane. Now look at John 18, 1, when Jesus was spoken these words and went forth with his disciples over the brook Kidron. And that's where we have the cross before you get to the Mount of Olives. So half of the discussion earlier was in the upper room. Then they drank the 4th cup and sang Psalms 113 and 18. There was more discussion on the walk to Gethsemane, and they just have reached it. He prays a prayer, and now they begin to climb the mountain of olives, and that's what the garden of Gethsemane was in Hebrew, meaning oil press. because on the side of the mountain they grew olive trees to produce olive oil to be used for the temple compound. Let's see. Now in paragraph 152, we have the agony of Gethsemane. He now undergoes a tremendous struggle. The preparation for it's in the garden. He leads 8 of his disciples by the gateway, found at the end of Mark 14:32. Sit ye here while I pray. And then he took Peter, James, and John further up and left them behind as a second watch. And then he went about a stone's throw further away and underwent the agony. And that's the way he's in agony. He's described in 6 specific statements. First of all, he was greatly amazed. And the word amazed in the Greek has the meaning to be utterly surprised, to be stunned with astonishment, utterly surprised. Secondly, he was sore troubled, meaning he was feeling very heavy, like a heavy weight was pressing upon him. Thirdly, his soul was exceedingly sorrowed. The term means to be pressed upon, emphasizing the extreme pressure that Jesus, that Yeshua, was under at the appointed time. Fourthly, he was exceedingly sorrowed, even unto death. The point is that his sorrow was so great, the pressure so severe, the trouble so heavy, the dangers totally collapsed his physical frame. Luke adds 2 other points. 50, he was in agony, and Luke 22:44, and the word meaning agony means conflict. He was in agony in the sense of being in conflict. Now, what exactly he was conflicted about, we'll discuss in a couple more minutes. For now, the whole 6th point, he began sweating blood, and on the PowerPoint here, I had the medical term for this. Hemohydrosis. Hemohydrosis means you're in such agony that the blood begins to seep through your vessels and come out sweat, but bloody sweat. He began to drop great sweats of blood falling to the ground. And it was in this juncture that an angel in Luke 22:43 come down to help to strengthen him. Now, what was he agonizing over? 2 things. One is found actually in the prophetic passage, Isaiah 49:1-13. He was agonizing over Israel's rejection of this messianic claims. He agonizes over Israel's failure to respond. But by this manner, the Father has chosen for the light to go out to the Gentiles. And because of Israel's rejection, he will become the light to the Gentiles. And mostly Gentiles will believe. But once the fullness of Gentiles comes and the body is complete, all of Israel will believe. That's the point of Isaiah 49:1-13. But the Gospels focus on the second element of his agony. Now looking at Mark's account, Mark 14:36, given the summary of his first prayer. Abba, Father, the things are possible unto you. Remove this cup from me. Howbeit not my will, but your will be done. The second thing he agonizes over is partaking of this cup, which we'll discuss in a couple minutes. And again, for the summary prayer, according to Mark's account, Mark 14:37, the first time of prayer took about an hour. And when he came back to where the disciples were, he found them sleeping. And in Mark 14:38, he tells them they need to keep on watching, lest they fall into temptation, because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And because they were not on guard is why they end up scattering and why Peter will end up denying them. He then went back to a second period of prayer, Matthew 26:42. Again, a summary statement. Again, a second time he went away and prayed, saying, "O my Father, this cannot pass away except I drink it. Your will be done." And again he went to the disciples and again found them sleeping. And then for the third time, in the Matthew 26:44, prayed the third time, saying again the same words. And the question is, what does he mean by this cup? And there have been 3 different suggestions over the years. One common suggestion is the cup represents his coming physical death. And what he agonizes over now is his physical death. And what he's asking is not to have to die physically. That's not a good way to interpret the cup, because it would mean he's asking for cancellation of the whole purpose of the incarnation. God, as God, cannot die. And one major reason God became man was so he could die for our sins. In John 10:17, he predicted he would die. If he does not die, they will call him a false prophet. Luke 19:10, he came for the purpose of dying. Philippians 2:8, part of his obedience was obedience to dying. Hebrews 10:5-9, his sole purpose was to come to die. And early in paragraph 130, he was mentioned that one thing he said is that he would not ask the Father not to die. That's what he said in paragraph 130. If he is now asking the Father not to die physically, then it meant he was not truthful in paragraph 130 and therefore sinned. So interpreting the cup as being physical death does not really settle all the questions. A second interpretation of the cup is it does not represent physical death per se, but premature death. What he's afraid of is dying before we got to the cross. That's a little better than the first option, but really is not a good answer either, because there was simply no danger of it. As he comes to the point of death, it's not Satan is in control. It's not the Jewish leaders who are in control. It's not Romans who are in control. He's in full control of his death, and if he wanted, he could have hung on the cross forever. Tomorrow we'll discuss his actual death and come to Luke 22:46. We'll note that Luke uses the Greek word that means to dismiss. He dismisses spirit from his body. He will choose the moment of his death. In previous paragraph in John 10:18, he declared, "No man takes his life from me, I lay it down on myself." And we'll see in the next couple of paragraphs, when the soldiers come to arrest them all, he has to say, "I am." And he forced them all right down to the ground. There was simply no danger of him dying prematurely. He would choose the moment of his death. I think the best answer to the meaning of the cup would be it signifies the wrath of God resulting in spiritual death. And what we mean by spiritual death is separation from God the Father. Now keep in mind, nowhere in the Old Testament was it ever prophesied that he would die spiritually. It was definitely prophesied he would die physically. There is no evidence that he would die spiritually in the prophecies about the Messiah in the Old Testament. Furthermore, for the atonement, it was not his physical death which was essential. What was essential was not his spiritual death that was essential, but it was essential for him to die physically. He said that wrong. It's fixed now. And by the shedding of the blood, remission of sin comes. Leviticus 7:11, the atonement comes by the shedding of innocent blood. Now, since his physical death was prophesied, it's essential for the atonement. He cannot legitimately ask not to die physically, but his spiritual death was not essential for the atonement, nor was it prophesied. He can legitimately ask not to have to die spiritually. It's hard for us to appreciate why he agonizes this way, because all of us who are born spiritually dead. Only once are we born again do we become spiritually alive. Until our new birth, we're spiritually dead. But here's someone that from the moment of his incarnation was spiritually alive. And keep in mind, we're dealing with this human spirit. The divine spirit couldn't die anyway. And that's through his human spirit. He was in the constant fellowship with God the Father. It was never interrupted. But now, when the sinful world will be placed upon him, and God the Father, as we'll see in the crucifixion scene tomorrow, turns away from him, that was something that caused him tremendous agony. And he prayed he would not have to partake of this cup. It was the will of God that the Father for him to partake of the wrath of God. And the second trial on the cross was he tomorrow. He does partake of the wrath of God. And while this is not essential for the atonement, it was important for another facet of his ministry, that of high priest in Hebrews 4:14 and 16. And for 3 hours to be suffering the wrath of God and be separated from God the Father. Now we experiences in Gethsemane teaches two basic principles that account for what you often hear on Christian networks today when you're on the TV. Often you hear that when you pray that positive confession. Just name it and claim it and frame it. It's yours. And don't throw in the little phrase, "if it's your will," because that's a negative confession. But the best motto we have of prayer life is the prayer of Jesus. How did he pray? Well, first off, he prayed. He made his desires known to God. "Let this cup pass from me." Then he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." That's the proper way to prayer. We should make our requests known to God, but leave it to his will, how he would choose to answer the prayer. And the misconception is that if you ask for something and you don't get it, it's because you haven't had enough faith. But did Jesus get his request? In that case, no. Was it because of a lack of faith? If that's what it was, then it makes him a sinner, because the Bible also teaches what is not of faith is sin. But the Bible does teach us sometimes God says no because of a lack of faith. That's in James 1. But sometimes God says no because he knows better what his goal for our life is down the road. We don't know his plans for the future, but he does. So sometimes a no answer is better for our maturity and our spiritual growth. He destroyed communism. Now he goes back to the disciples and finds them asleep again. In Mark 14:41, he tells them, "You can now keep on sleeping because the Son of Man is about to be betrayed." All right. Did we get to all of it? No. We're going into the next part. All right. So once again, let me review. Right? We've been going through this book. We're underneath the section 9, I think it is. Yeah, 9. The rejection of the king. We just did the arrest, the Sanhedrin trial, and the Messianic trial. No, we're going into that. I'm sorry. The rejection of the king. This brings us to the 9th division of his life, which involves the rejection of the king. This involves the trial and then involves the death of the Messiah, comprised in paragraph 153 and 168, the arrest. In paragraph 153, we come to the arrest. And as we saw in our development of the thematic account of his life, that the foundational reason why he was rejected was because. So this is just a foreshadow of what we're going to be talking about. According to Exodus 23:8, there will be no arrest by ecclesiastical authority that was affected by a bribe. There will be no steps of criminal proceedings after sunset. Judges and Sanhedrin members could not participate in the arrest. There were to be no trials before the morning sacrifice. All trials will be public. Secret trials will be forbidden. Sanhedrin trials were only to be held in the hall of judgment in the temple compound. The proper procedure for trials was to be first the defense and the accusation. The judges who argued for innocence were to speak before the ones who argued for guilt. So we're going into this. So there's 22 rules that they break. And now to expedite the arrest and the death, they'll end up breaking 22 rules of their own. Regulations on how the arrest and trial should be conducted. On the outline and listed all these rules on the back page is a new Ariel letterhead. All right, so we can go on right on to this. We'll see exactly how they're broken. 1. There was to be no arrest by religious authorities that was affected by a bribe. We already know this was affected by a bribe, 30 pieces of silver. 2. There will be no steps of criminal proceedings after sunset. The purpose here was to avoid conspiracy and use the nighttime to carry the conspiracy out. Once the sun was officially set, they could not proceed with criminal proceedings. And the sun officially set by Jewish law once you can see 3 stars. Once 3 stars are visible, the sun is set. 3. Judges and Sanhedrin members were not allowed to participate in their arrests. That was to keep them neutral. If they participate in the arrests, they take sides. 4. There were to be no trials before the morning sacrifice. All their daily morning rituals had to be out of the way before a trial could be conducted. 5. All trials were to be public. Secret trials were forbidden, again to avoid the conspiracy. 6. Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the hall of the judgment of the temple compound. Because our trials had to be public, by the way, the public would have to know where to go to observe the trial. And that's why they be for the Sanhedrin trial. That's where it had to be held. 7. The proper procedure with the trial was to be first the defense and then the accusation. That's the opposite of our Western system. All the reasons why a person could not be guilty of anything had to be presented first. His character witness have to be first before the charge were presented by the 2 witnesses. The judges who argued innocence were to speak before the ones who argued for guilt. 8. While the judges are made argue in favor of acquittal, all may not argue in favor of guilt. It was all right to stack the deck in an accused's favor, so all the judges could argue in favor of acquittal, but they could not argue in favor of guilt. The accuser had to have at least one defender. All right. So, going back to this. While all judges of the Sanhedrin may argue in favor of acquittal, all may not argue in favor of guilt. On the basis of Deuteronomy 19:15, there were to be 2 or 3 witnesses, and their testimonies had to be in perfect detail. There was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. Based on Leviticus 22:10, the high priest was forbidden to tear his garments. The charges against the defendant were not to originate with the judges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. When the charges were blasphemy, guilt could only be established if the defendant was actually pronounced the very name of God. A person could never be condemned on the basis of his own words alone. The judge's verdict could not be announced at night. Based on Deuteronomy 19:15, there had to be 2 or 3 witnesses, and their testimony would have to be agreed in every detail. There was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. There was to avoid 2 possible situations. Number 1, the person might be suicidal and confessing to a crime he did not commit. Or he might be, secondly, trying to protect someone else and confessing a crime he did not commit. And therefore, the 2 witnesses have to be outside the occurrence, and he cannot testify against himself in the court of law. Based on Leviticus 21:10, the high priest was forbidden to rend or tear his garments. Now, in the Jewish society, the rending their clothing is a sign of emotion. When a family member dies, if the family members tear their clothing and walk around with torn clothing for 7 days. If a non-member of the family marries a non-Jew, other members will tear their clothing. When a member becomes a believer in the Messiahship of Yeshua, Jesus, other members will tear their clothing, because the trial had to be determined based upon the facts presented by witness, not based upon emotions. The high priest could not tear his garments at a trial, at a Jewish trial. Big Stack, I guess you made a comment that was a mismatch and you erased your comments. Hopefully I see how you were responding. Maybe you didn't like how it was reworded before. I don't care. It's whatever you prefer. I just want you to sit back and listen to the word. Kick it. Anyway. The charges against the offender were not to originate with the judges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. Again, it was to keep them neutral. If they originated the charge, they take its sides. When the charge for blasphemy, the guilt could only be established if the person pronounced the actual name of God. And again, in the Hebrew, the name of God comprises four Hebrew letters. They would correspond to the Latin letters Yod, He, Vav, He. Unless you pronounce the name of God, you could not technically be accused of blasphemy. A person could not be condemned on the basis of their own words alone. Again, they had to separate two witnesses. The verdict could not be announced at night, only in the daytime. This was to avoid a rush of judgment. It may have been a long, very long day listening to the witness. Yeah, I had an after show the other day where I had a long day and affected my judgment, my interpretation of a certain situation. Anyway, this was to avoid a rush of judgment. It may have been a very long day listening to the witness, questioning the accused, people getting tired of touchy and itching. Monday Night Football was coming on fast. So to make sure they don't rush to judgment, even if they knew what the verdict was going to be, if those 3 stars are visible, it had to be postponed to the next day. Man, my fan always flips over, so I'm roasting over here. All right, so back to this. In the case of capital punishment, the trial and the verdict of guilt could not occur at the same time. They had to be separated by at least 24 hours. What if the death penalty had to be done by individual counting, beginning with the youngest judge, so that the younger would not be influenced by the elders? A unanimous decision for guilt showed innocence, since it was impossible for a minimum of 23 men or maximum of 71 men to agree without plotting. And so that was Dr. Fruitbaum's favorite one. Oh no. The sentence could only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. Judges were to be humane and kind. A person condemned to death could not be beaten or scourged beforehand. No trials are allowed on the eve of the Sabbath or on the feast day. In case of capital punishment, the trial and the verdict of guilt could not occur at the same time. They had to be separated by at least 24 hours. This is to allow for more time for more information to come in the favor of the curse. 17. Voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so the young would not be influenced by the elders. 18. By far my favorite law, the 22 laws, and number 18. A unanimous decision for guilt showed innocence, since it's impossible for a minimum of 23 men or a maximum of 71 men to agree without plotting. The figure 71 is the full membership of the Sanhedrin, but all 71 members did not have to be there for a trial to be conducted, but there had to be a minimum of 23. In the Jewish society, it was inconceivable that 23 Jews could agree unless there was a plot involved. Based upon the observation I mentioned in the past, the Jews happened to like to argue with each other. And again, 2 Jews, 3 different opinions, and this illustrates the particular situation. So it was inconceivable that there wouldn't be some kind of a disagreement. 19. The sentence could be pronounced only 3 days after the guilty verdict. While the trial and the verdict of guilt had to be separated by 24 hours, 3 more days would have to pass before the sentence was pronounced. For the same reason, more time for more information to come into favor of the accused. 20. Judges were to be humane and kind. 21. A person condemned to death could not be beaten or scourged beforehand. And 22. No trials are allowed on the eve of the Sabbath day or on the feast day. Now these are not all the laws of the Sanhedrin. There are actually hundreds of others and not the thousands, but these are the ones I put out of Jewish writings that were broken either during the rest of the trial and I point out where it happens. So we're getting into this, the religious trial, the trial before Annas, the trial before Caiaphas, the denial by Peter, the mockery and beating, the condemnation by the Sanhedrin, the death of Judas. Then we're going to some metanoia, metalomai, map showing Tophet, right? Metanoia, repentance, change of mind, metalomai, remorse, full of regret. Now, as far as the dealing with paragraph 153, we are now past midnight. It's now 15th of Nisan, April 7th, AD 30. Now, John's account, John 18:32, we have the breaking of the first of those 22 rules. Here we have an arrest taking place and affected by a bribe, as we saw earlier. This was the violation of the first of the rules in the end of John 18:3. They carried lamps and torches, which shows it was still nighttime, which would break rule number 2 on your list here. No steps of criminal proceedings after sunset. Now here we find the fulfilling the first 2 of the 3 purposes. Again, this is talking about Judas. And if the first purpose was a show where he could be arrested apart from the multitudes, that's what he was doing right now in John's account in John 18:2. He's been the disciple of Jesus now for some time. He knew the habits of Jesus, and he knew that one of these habits was when he came to Jerusalem, he resorts to the Garden of Gethsemane for a time of prayer. Now, for the gospel, this is the only record we have of him doing so. But John specifies in verse 2, Jesus oftentimes resorted thither. So John tells us this was a common habit of his. And he came to Jerusalem a minimum of 3 times a year, if not more, at least 3 times a year. And this became the place of prayer. And therefore, he could show where he could be arrested apart from the multitudes. Why does it say the chat is disconnected? I wonder if you can hear me reckon, waiting to see what is happening. Maybe it's the bad internet then. Hopefully you still hear my beating. Otherwise, you're going to be pleading for me to stop and get back on topic. But you're like, man, I can't have that nonsense. It looks like the connection has been restored. So I'll go back to where I was before. All right. And this became the place of prayer. Therefore, he could show where he could be arrested apart from the multitudes. Now, John's account in John 18:3 says that he received a band. Notice the number, the word band. The footnote tells you the Greek word means cohort. It means cohort. He received a cohort of Roman soldiers. And again, a Roman cohort could not be released to make an arrest until someone first appeared before the Roman governor, accusing one of a crime punishable by Roman law. Now keep in mind, part of the conspiracy was not to carry the conspiracy out of this night. When Jesus twice identified Judas the betrayer, he forced her hand. And when Judas at the Passover meal with Jesus and the other apostles, he would not have gone to the chief priests who paid him. And obviously they're afraid that he might get away from them because he obviously knew about the conspiracy. They took him quickly to Pontius Pilate, who normally would be stationed in Caesarea 2 days away. But he always came up to Jerusalem to help maintain order during the festival, which made it convenient. And so they brought Judas to Pontius Pilate. He accused Jesus of a crime punishable by Roman law, and that's when he received the cohort of the Roman soldiers. This helped to explain 2 things. First, it helps explain why in the initial stage of the Jewish trial, things are already confused and disorganized. They don't have their act together. They have to go out running to find false witnesses. It takes a while to finally get their trial organized. Also, secondly, it helps to explain that although it is the very wee hours of the morning, while Pilate is just ready to conduct the trial, he was anticipating the trial because he released a Roman cohort. And altogether, a sizable group of people come again to arrest one individual. First of all, you have the Roman cohort. A Roman cohort is anywhere from 400 up to 600 soldiers. So keep in mind you have a minimum of 400 soldiers up to 600 Roman soldiers. But they're not alone. The second group is the group of 1 in Luke 22:15, the servant of the high priest. Now, this is the crucial hours between the first night of the Passover and then the first day of the Passover. In those crucial hours that he could not leave the compound unless he came in contact with something to make him unclean, and he could not offer up a special Passover sacrifice that will be offered up on the first day of the Passover, so he cannot leave the compound. But he sent out a servant to make sure things went correctly. Now, to go to Luke's account, Luke 22:52, a third element is in the middle of verse 52, the captain of the temple. These are the temple Jewish police, the Jewish temple police. Their third element is the participants and the rest. But also notice in verse 52, he mentioned the chief priests before the captains, the elders after the captains. These are 2 categories of Sanhedrin members, and they participated in the rest. So we see at verse 52, you have the violation of law number 3. Judges or members cannot participate in the rest, and they do. So as Matthew points out in Matthew 26:47, a great multitude comes in. This large body of men comes in to arrest one individual. Jesus quickly takes the scene, takes the initiative, and John accounts into John 18:5. He asked them whom you seek. And in verse 5, they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to him, I am. And the way the phrase I am reads, it can be taken in 2 different ways. One way to take it is that I am Jehovah of the Old Testament, and one who revealed himself to Moses is I am that I am. The second way to take it is simplified I am he, Anihu in Hebrew. I am the Jesus you are looking for. Now in his confrontation with the Roman soldiers and the other men, here he will say, I am twice. The first time he says I am, it'll be display of his deity. Second time he says I am, it will mean the simplified. I'm the one you're looking for. So in verse 5, he says I am for the first time. And if John's editorial comment that Judas is standing in the crowd. Also verse 6 says, when therefore, when what for? For the very reason he said to them, I am. They went backward and fell to the ground. The first time he says I am is a display of his deity. By simply saying I am, he forced them all to fall down backward to the ground. And it shows who's in control, which shows him he would not be arrested until he allows himself to be arrested. A small hint of what's going to happen at the second coming, when the power of Rome will fall to its knees at the feet of the King of the Jews. Now, when people came in contact with the Lord, it says throughout Scripture, they always fell forward. Falling backward is not a blessing, it's a sign of judgment. Next time you turn on TBN, keep that in mind. Falling backward is not a blessing, but a discipline. That's his shot at the charismatics, or the extreme ones at least. After showing them his control, he asked them again in John 18:7, whom do you seek? And they answered, Jesus of Nazareth. So in verse 8, he says, I am. Now he makes it simplified, I am he. I am the one you're looking for. So he asks, if therefore for a very specific reason you seek me, let these go. Meaning let the other men with me go, since I'm the one you're looking for. So by now, notice he identified himself twice, the soldiers coming in after him. Now, there's already an arrangement made between Judas and the captain of the cohort. Then in Mark 14:14, the arrangement was not to arrest anyone till they see whom he kisses. And in Matthew 48, the kiss is to be a sign whom they should arrest. And now there's no need for him to proceed any further. He insists on earning his keep. And at the end of Luke's account, Luke 22:47, he drew nearer to Jesus to kiss him. He now begins to approach him to apply the kiss, but even before the kiss is applied, in Luke's account, verse 48, Jesus warns him against proceeding. He still insists. At the end of Mark 14:45, he says, Rabbi, and kiss him. He calls him Rabbi and kiss him. Again, notice the number of the word kiss in the footnote. Potentially the Greek means kissed him much, not one kiss, but many kisses. What Judas is doing here is profaning what was then considered sacred among the Jewish people, because the kissing the rabbis was the meaning of submission to the rabbi. When a man became a disciple of a specific rabbi, he would kiss the rabbi. And also he uses the term rabbi. It's not a kiss of honor or homage, it's a kiss of betrayal. He's profaning something that was scared among them, the Jewish people. At this point, Peter decides he would take action. In John's account, John 18:10 says Peter draws out a sword. The word refers to a long ceremonial knife, the kind of knife that was used to kill the Passover lamb, of which he and John were in charge of. Now visualize the scene in the garden. At this moment, you have 400 up to 600 Roman soldiers. You have the Jewish temple police, among others, all carrying the swords. Peter pulls out the one long knife, and you think he could pull off a Jewish Rambo. He very quickly proves that by a profession, he's not a soldier, but a fisherman. He takes one swing at someone's hand, misses, and cuts off the man's right ear. But he used good Jewish wisdom as to who he attacked. Notice he did not attack a Roman soldier. He did not attack a Jewish police officer. He attacked a servant of the high priest who may or may not have been armed himself. At least he was positively the weakest link in the chain, and he cut off the man's right ear. Now, when you're harmony, notice the awful gospel writer spelled out the fact that in the front of all of the soldiers and police officers, Peter put out his sword and cut off the man's right ear. Notice only one person chooses to record the ear was healed, and that's Dr. Luke again. Luke's account, Luke 22:51. He alone points out that Jesus healed the ear and put the ear back on the head. For Matthew, Mark, and John, the most exciting thing right there is when all the soldiers and police officers, Peter cuts off the man's right ear. As far as God, Jesus put in the ear back on the head. They've even greater things than that, but no big deal. But for Luke, it was significant enough to mention, and the healing no doubt saved Peter's life. Then in Matthew's gospel, Jesus teaches Peter's 3 lessons. First of all, in Matthew 26:52, all who live by the sword will die by the sword. The sword cannot be used for the defense of faith. There's a proper time to use the sword for personal defense of the faith. For the faith, we must turn the other cheek. For the faith, we must be willing to become martyrs if necessary. Secondly, in Matthew 26:53, this happens to be actually a spiritual conflict and therefore must be fought by spiritual means. He happens to have 12 legions of angels at his disposal, having 12 legions of angels, even legion from 3,000 to 6,000 angels. He did not leave Peter's one long knife. All right. And thirdly, in verse 54 and 56, this is all essential for the fulfillment of the prophecy. This is what we had to be fulfilled. The disciples realized he will do no more, but he's actually done to defend themselves in Mark 14:50. The disciples gather and disperse. Then Mark adds a small incident about a disciple, someone in the crowd, had to flee away naked. The purpose of Mark 14:51-52 is not to lay down a biblical basis for streaking. Now, in ancient biographies, if the author of the biography was an eyewitness of some of the events, he would often put himself in the story when he was an eyewitness. For example, John's Gospel, he refers to himself as a disciple whom Jesus loved, not implying he didn't love the others as well. That's the way John wrote himself into the story when he was an eyewitness in the book of Acts. For example, when Luke switches from the third person into the first person, that's where Luke is an eyewitness. So based upon the way biographies were written, that one in verse 52, 1 and 52 would be Mark himself and happened to be there. And there's an eyewitness to the event that just occurred. The religious trial. All right. Something's going wrong with my chat. It's not showing all y'all's messages. Not sure why. Now we come to paragraph 154. Paragraph 154 and 158. We come to the religious trial. He will undergo two separate trials. He will undergo a religious trial, which is the Jewish trial, then the civil trial, which is the Roman and Gentile trial. And both trials have three separate segments for a total of 6 segments. And some will call it 6 different trials, but the 2 broad trials, a Jewish one and a Gentile one. The trial before Annas. Now, the first stage of the Jewish trial was the trial before Annas in paragraph 154, and the issue in the religious trial is going to be the issue of blasphemy. This will not be the issue in the civil trial, but it's the issue in the religious Jewish trial, the issue of the blasphemy. In the first stage of the trial before Annas, Annas served as high priest from the year 7 to year 1418, and he was then deposed by the Roman governor Valerius Gratus. But he was able to maintain control of the high priesthood because he followed the succession by 4 of his own sons and by his son-in-law until the end of his life by his grandson. And again, he was a Sadducee. He controlled the business ventures of the temple compound, like the changing of the money, selling of the sacrifices, business venture that Jesus overthrew on the first and last Passover of his public ministry. So Annas had his own private grudge against Jesus. And the purpose of the trial is to establish a religious charge. And again, they're confused and disorganized because they did not anticipate having to conduct a trial on this night. The original conspiracy was to wait until after Passover. Now Jesus forced their hand. And again, in John 18:12, they bring him right before Annas for the trial, which breaks rule number 4 on your list. There'll be no trials before the morning sacrifice. And this one occurs before the morning sacrifice in John 18:20-21. It makes it clear this is a secret trial, breaking number 5 of your list. No secret trials allowed. Now, John 18:19, the high priest asked Jesus of the former high priest, questioned Jesus about 2 things. First of all, while disciples to incriminate him, of his teachers to incriminate him. But now the tables are turned because under Jewish civil law, during the trials, he's not responsible to answer the question. They're responsible to produce the 2 or 3 witnesses. So he points out to them, since everything he taught publicly, even if he said anything amiss or anything blasphemous, they should have no trouble having the 2 witnesses. They need to condemn him, and this was to show his right to do and to make his beating the first of several times of the night. The end product of the first stage of the trial is they cannot produce a specific charge. The trial before Caiaphas. Paragraph 155, we come to the second stage, the trial before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas happened to be the son-in-law of Annas. He served as high priest from the year 25 until the year 36 AD. And the trial takes place at the midpoint of the high priesthood at AD 30. Now Luke's account of Luke 14:52 specifies they brought him into the home of the high priest. And this will break rule number 6 on your list, that a Sanhedrin trial could only be conducted in the hall of judgment on the temple compound. Now again, the Sanhedrin was comprised of 71 members, but they carefully divided up certain party lines. 24 seats went to the chief priests, and all 24 chief priests were Sadducees. 24 seats went to the elders, and 24 elders were Pharisees. 22 more seats went to the scribes, and all 22 scribes were Pharisees. The last seat went to the high priest himself, a Sadducee. And so the majority vote was to the Pharisees, but the proceedings were conducted by a Sadducee. And again, it was not necessary to have all 71 members there, but they had to have a minimum of 23. If you had only the minimum 11 votes was sufficient to acquit, 11 of votes sufficient to acquit, 13 votes would be necessary to convict. Conviction had to be by a majority of 2, not 1. We're not told how many of the Sanhedrin members were there. We know all 71 members were not there because later in the gospel, we noticed that Nicodemus was not there. And Joseph Arimathea was not there. The most they had present was 69 or less, but no more. Now Matthew 26 and 59 says, the chief priests and the whole council saw false witness against Jesus. They have to go find the false witnesses. They don't have them ready. Again, because they were not intended to do this on the night. They will begin with the false witness, which will break law number 7 on your list. The procedure was to be the first defense and the accusation. And notice it also specifies the whole council went the same direction, which will break number 8 on your list. So will argue in favor of acquittal, almost not argue in favor of guilt. They bring one false witness after another, trying to find two witnesses that say the same thing. But there are so many discrepancies that one by one, they're all disqualified. They finally find two men that seem to say the same thing because they seem to say the same thing, the last two witnesses that they can find. These two are presented as official witnesses in the court. And in Mark 15:59 says, not even so did their witnesses agree together. Although they seem to say the same thing before they were brought before the court, there are the ones in discrepancy which render the case invalid, their testimony invalid. We can prove the difference by comparing Mark and Matthew. Mark says in Mark 14:58, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple. And Matthew quotes the other witnesses saying in Matthew 20:61, this man said, I'm able to destroy the temple. So did he say, I will do so, or did he say, I'm able to do so? One is a statement of ability. One is a statement of actual intent. It is the small discrepancy that disqualified the last two witnesses that they have. And in Mark 14:59, therefore they should have them released. And failure to release them of verse 59 will violate the number 9 on your list. There is to be 2 or 3 witnesses. Their testimony have to agree in every detail. Hey, Taylor. All these exasperate Caiaphas. So Matthew 26:62, he stands up and says, do you answer nothing? Which is that which a witness is against you? To respond and speak now. When he did not have 2 witnesses presenting the official charge, will break law number 10 on your list. There were to be no allowance for accused to testify against himself. And in keeping with the Jewish civil rights, Matthew 26:63 says he held his peace. He doesn't have to respond to this stage. And this frustrates Caiaphas even further. So when Matthew 26:63, he puts Jesus under the oath, I adjure you by the living God, you tell us whether you be the Christ, the Son of God. And based upon what Caiaphas says, notice he understands 2 things. First, he understood clearly who Jesus claimed to be. Yeshua claimed to be the Messiah. And secondly, he knew who Messiah was supposed to be. He was supposed to be the Son of God. Now, by Jewish civil law was placed on the oath, you must respond. So he does. And Mark 14:62 says, I am, meaning yes, I am the Messiah, the Son of God. He goes on to add in Matthew 26:64 that someday know the truth of his claim in 2 ways. Number 1, they will see him seated at the right hand of God. Secondly, they will see him coming in the clouds of heaven. The second coming will be visible in hell itself. Now, several things happened in rather quick succession. Matthew 26:65. Then the high priest rents his garment, which will break number 11. The high priest is forbidden to tear his clothing. The verse continues saying, he has spoken blasphemy. Notice he originates a charge of blasphemy. That it means a charge originated with the judge. Breaking rule number 12. Charges could not originate with the judges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. Furthermore, the specific charge of blasphemy, which breaks rule number 13 on your list. The accusation of blasphemy was only valid to pronounce the name of God itself, which he did not do at this trial. He goes on to add, what further need have we of witnesses? A rather monogamous statement. He doesn't have any more witnesses. The last 2 got disqualified. He's asking for a condemnation strictly on what Jesus just said, which would violate law number 14. A person cannot be condemned based on his own words alone. In Matthew 26:66, the answer that said he is worthy of death. They go ahead and pronounce him guilty. Breaking law number 15, the verdict cannot be announced at night, only in the daytime. Furthermore, breaks number 16, because this is capital offense, and a trial and a guilty verdict could not occur at the same time. They had to be separated by at least 24 hours. Furthermore, it's done by acclamation, which breaks number 17. What if the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so they would not be influenced by the elders? Now look at Mark's account, Mark 14:64, the second part of the verse, because he adds a small detail Matthew left out. They all condemned him to be worthy of death. Notice the word all. It was unanimous decision. So by Jewish law, he should have been released. From the failure to release him will violate law number 18. The unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence. It's impossible for 23 up to 71 men to agree without plotting. Further, to pronounce the sentence is worthy of death, which breaks law number 19. Sentence was only been pronounced 3 days after the verdict of the guilt. Now Mark 14:65, and some began to spit on him, to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to saying to him, prophesying, the officers receive him with the blows of their hands. Matthew says in Matthew 26:67 that they spit in his face and buffet him, and so smote him with the palm of their hands. How you have the breaking of the number 20. They were to be humane and kind, and also 21. A person condemned to death could not be beaten or scourged beforehand. The chat disconnected again. Now go back to paragraph 154. The first time he receives a physical mistreatment is in John 8:22 and 23. And now with the paragraph Mark 14:65 and Matthew 26:67. That's the second of several mistreatments he will have on this night. And furthermore, he now suffers 3 high indignities under Jewish law. First of all, some hit him with the fist. And if you hit someone with your fist, that was punishable by a fine of 4 denarii. Now 1 denarius was equal to 1 day wages. So 4 denarii is 4 days wages. Still, more insulting was the second thing he suffered. Some hit him with the palm of their hand, slap him. That was punishable by a fine of 200 denarii, 200 days' wages. That's the third thing he suffered, is some spit in his face, and is even more insulting. That was punishable by a fine of 400 denarii, more than a year's wages. And while we suffered these 3 high indignities under Jewish law, one thing is certain: no one was fined for their actions on that night. The last thing in this paragraph is that it happens to fall between the first night of the Passover and the first day of the Passover, and therefore violated law number 22. There will be no trials on the eve of the Sabbath or on the feast day. So we'll be stopping here. We are a little bit behind. We have maybe taken extra time tomorrow to finish, because we need to finish tomorrow. Anyway, he's talking about that. But here's a joke, guys. There was a Jewish man who was very orthodox. He raised his son to be orthodox. To be surprised, his son became a Christian. He was so ashamed of that, he just wouldn't say a word to anybody, but he kept burning him. He had to talk to somebody. So he had a friend named Levi, and he knew Levi, probably be Levi, could keep a secret. So he goes to Levi and says, I have a son. He became a Christian, and I don't know how to respond to this. And to his surprise, his friend says, I too have a son, and you became a Christian. I was so ashamed I didn't even tell you, my best friend. I had the same problem you do. I don't have any suggestions. We have a very wise rabbi. I'm sure you can tell what we should do. Let's go talk to him. So all their sons are becoming Christian, right? So they're going to the rabbi. They tell this story to the rabbi. The rabbi say, I too have a son, and he could become a Christian. And I was so afraid of losing my job in the synagogue, I couldn't tell anybody. I got the same problem you do. We must keep this quiet between us, because it's very embarrassing. We have to not let people know about this. This is what I suggest. Let's close the doors and close the windows. Let's pray to God of Israel. Maybe somehow he'll convey to us what we should do. And so they closed the doors, they closed the windows, they began to wail to God about the situation. And finally they hear a voice from heaven, and the voice says, I too have a son. In other words, they're going to become Christians because, the Father's testifying to the Son. And I think that's it. This chart will come up later on. Yeah, that looks like everything for now. That looks like it's everything for now. But don't think for a second that I'm going to throw in the towel. Some people are like, man, don't have a cow. But if you did, you would probably do it like the Exodus, which would mean that you would do like what they did with that Aaron kid. They would have a golden calf, and they wouldn't be holding back with the stuff that they thought they were worshiping God with. Instead of them thinking they were giving God a lift. But the reality was is the smell of the incense was a bad whiff in his nose that makes him want to be opposed from his throne. It made it such a stench. It didn't make any sense. So they wonder how could they commit this apostasy sin that they went and commit? I don't know, but some people think that a Christian can commit it, so they think that they're so legit. But what I got to tell them is, man, they should really go and quit, because they're making arguments that contradict themselves. And so they really need some help. They're trying to stay below the radar like a stealth. But what can I say? They're going to take their faith off the shelf and make it useful. What can I say? They got to do more than a spoonful. Usual. There's no more coffee for you, Charles. That's the only way I could get through my lecture reading. I still got to do my other reading. But yeah. All right. I think I'll land the plane now. Hopefully you had a great day now. So I'm going to go now. I hope y'all like this beat. I'm gonna use it. I'm gonna be using it. So, like I said, I got the paperwork on it and everything. So, all right. God bless, guys. Check out more content, old stuff, new stuff.